I just want to welcome you and thank you for joining us to this support group. We're going to be doing things just slightly differently, but I hope everyone is staying safe and healthy. My name's Jolie, and I am Dr. Linden's practice manager at the Attention Learning Center. And for those of you that might not know, Dr. Linden has been working with in the field of clinical psychology for over 30 years and was one of the first clinicians to start doing neurofeedback in Orange County. He helped to develop the test called the QEEG, which is FDA approved for the diagnosis of ADHD, and he's also helped to develop a lot of software used for neurofeedback treatments. So he's given talks and trainings to other clinicians all over the world and has been providing support groups like this one for parents and adults at Saddleback Church and Mariners Church for many, many years. Dr. Linden's goal is to help people navigate and work through complex problems to find the right path to getting a clear diagnosis and treatment plan that'll lead to success rather than having to go through many trials and errors with medications and suffer through the wrong treatments, sometimes costing thousands of dollars wasted. Feel free to go to our website and log into any of the videos that we have there. Hopefully you'll find some really valuable information. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Michael Linden. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the introduction, Julie. And as she was saying, my name is Dr. Michael Linden. This is a slide with just some history and background. This is actually part of our parent ADD support group through Saddleback Church that we're doing remotely. This is starting on our 28th year of having this support group. So when I had the first support group 28 years ago, we were in one of the portable buildings in the Lake Forest campus at Saddleback Church, and we had more than 100 people come in a room that held 35. So things have changed a lot since then. What we've done is these groups are remote now, and there's a list of these on our website. Our next support group for parents is October 22nd, and we have them all the way through December. Typically, they've been more like a talking and sharing support group, but there's so many questions I've been getting about topics like, what should I do to get my kids ready to school? Should they go in person? They're anxious about COVID and going back. And recently I've been getting a lot of questions about accommodations. How can my students, whether they're in kindergarten or you're a college student yourself, how can I get help in the schools? And it's a complicated question because as the schools are just opening in person now, their testing and their accommodations process is months and months behind. They're still working on catching up from requests from before COVID back in April and March. So I'm going to do, this is the first time we're talking about this in a support group or even a talk. I did want to remind you, like Julie said, we have regular webinars. We have one next week specifically about attention deficit disorder. But I'm going to be doing like an abbreviated webinar and then take questions at the end so we can kind of get into this more. This is a very, very important topic because there's a need for accommodations. I'm going to talk about what those are. Basically, this is how you can get your students or a college student, how you can get extra time, quiet room for tests, tutoring, social skills, a special class for your students. And they're doing some online, but as schools start back up starting next week, some schools in San Diego have opened already, this is even more important. So I'm going to start by telling you a story about one of the students I worked with years ago. I've been, like I said, in practice for 36 years now. And what keeps me passionate is seeing people that have had a hard time getting the right diagnosis or getting help, and what happens to them when we get the right diagnosis, and then what happens to them down the road. I don't get a chance to meet with a lot of people afterwards, although I met with people, 30 years after I've seen them. But this is a typical example of why we want to get tested. This person actually was interviewed on a TV show I did called The Doctors on CBS about 10 years ago. And his mother called me back the beginning of this year and said, "We met about 10 years ago. I remember the terror my son was. He was impulsive. He had outbursts. I was completely at my wit's end. But my son became a different person, a different kid, the same son, but with a different attitude and behavior. One teacher who worked with him for 3 years couldn't believe the improvements after the neurofeedback therapy. You gave my life back after the treatment. What you literally do is life-changing, and I thank you once again for all your help." I say this just to give you some hope, because between having your kids at home and trying to get them to go to school remotely and parent them and everything we've been through in the last couple months, some of you are at your wit's end like this, and some of you are pretty hopeless or scared and we don't know what's going to happen. But I'm going to give you a lot of information and hopefully a lot of support and help, and then we'll open it up for questions at the end. One of the reasons I got interested in this, and I got interested in this when I was in my 20s finishing my undergraduate degree, is we didn't know this, but I realized my brother and sister, who are younger than me, both had ADD and were misdiagnosed. My brother was misdiagnosed with dyslexia, an older term that's still used now. It's a type of learning disability, but there's attention and processing problems with it. Why was he not diagnosed? Because he was bright. He ended up getting his MBA from an Ivy League school, but it took him 8 years to get his 4-year college degree. It took him 4 years to get his 1.5-year MBA. He got a really good job, but he never got an accurate diagnosis. He told me when he went to see the doctors, they said, "You can't have ADD because you're in graduate school." You know, there's a lot of things we didn't know 30 years ago, but he never got the right diagnosis. And as he got older, like a lot of students we see, he became anxious, he became depressed. He never got the right treatment. He never was able to be successful in a career or a relationship. And he's been unemployed for many years, even before COVID. So I really realized what happens if somebody doesn't get the right diagnosis and treatment when they're younger. And what I realized in this journey I've been on for almost 40 years is that God really gave me this passion to help me discover things that help my family members, but have helped thousands of people over the years. I've looked at 10,000 of these QEEG tests we're going to go over. And by discovering this brain test we're going to talk about and the other tests we're going to talk about, it helped me kind of get a window to see what's going on in the brain. And doing that, we can train the brain, and we can train it naturally and kind of more of a natural healing, not something artificial that has side effects that isn't going to last. So my journey a couple years after that went to my sister. My sister was the hyperactive one in the family, not my brother. Usually the boys are more hyperactive. She was also diagnosed with dyslexia. This was in the early 1990s. She had ADHD. She could never sit still at a restaurant. She could never sit still in school. But why was she missed? She was missed because she was a successful athlete. And she played 2 sports. She got a scholarship to college in 2 sports. It was only when she couldn't exercise and she couldn't compete that she had problems. And then it really showed up that it was hard for her. Now, back then, even more than now, if you were a college athlete, you really got a lot of help in school, didn't have to really, get straight A's in school to get a scholarship and get your degree. So when she graduated college, she became a trainer, and then a new sport was starting, female boxing. Probably the worst sport at the time anywhere for your brain. I actually saw her box, and as exciting as I was at the beginning, when I saw her get hit in the head and have concussions, I was really scared. And we did one of these QEEG brain map tests, and it showed that her head injury discriminant, there's a statistic, was right on the edge of having permanent damage. And she did retire. She's a personal trainer now. She has had some treatment. She's doing better. She still has some kind of attention and technical issues, but she's doing a lot better. But it helped me to realize why we can't wait. Now, this technology I'm talking about for these tests These tests for the school accommodations have been around for 60 years. The tests for the brain imaging, the QEEG, have been around for 30 years. So it's not new, but probably a lot of you have never heard about these tests. So I also had a journey happen with autism with my cousin who lives north of LA. And this is kind of a typical scenario that happens now. Your child has problems in school and behavior, you go to your physician. You see them for 15 minutes, especially if it's an HMO. My cousin's child, Elijah, was not speaking. He wasn't having eye contact. He was having all these classic symptoms of autism. They went to Kaiser. Kaiser diagnosed him with ADHD and wanted to put him on a stimulant medication. So by the way, if you have autism and you take a stimulant medication, it often makes you worse. His speech was delayed. The school wouldn't do any testing. And nowadays, the schools aren't doing testing because they're backlogged and with COVID. So we did testing, we did the brain map, we got a formal diagnosis of autistic spectrum disorder. We went back to the school, we wrote a report, he got an IEP, which I'll talk about, an individual education plan. He got help in school, he got speech therapy, he got help in reading and math. He did some training and neurofeedback. His speech improved, his academics improved. He actually got advanced in reading. And what I learned from this it's been about 7-8 years ago, I learned the flip side of waiting. If you don't wait and you get tested and help as soon as possible, your journey is much more successful and your outcomes are much more successful. And that's what and she told me to use her and her son as an example, because they would have been much more delayed in getting help for him. So, I always think we've had a healthcare crisis in our country, no matter what political orientation you are, but it's even worse now, not just because of politics, but because of COVID. COVID has kind of put our health issues on hold, other than vaccines and treatments. And it's obviously that's extremely important. But let me tell you what's happened in our country. In our country, 1 out of 5 people are on psychiatric medications, but this was before COVID. This has increased 75%. The statistics are almost 1 out of 2 people. So think about that. Medicine for anxiety, depression, sleep, medical illnesses, COVID. I mean, it's incredible. 1 out of 10 students have ADD, but if you have ADD and you're going to school on the internet like now, imagine how difficult that would be to do. 1 out of 36 students have Asperger's or autism. This number used to be 1 out of 1,000. We're much better at diagnosing this and picking this up when students are younger. 50% of children have anxiety now, 50%. It used to be 1 out of 5. Depression is up to, this says 40%, but it's almost up to 50%. Those of you who follow the news know that we're having a mental health crisis now because of all the anxiety and depression and post-traumatic stress disorder that's happening because of COVID. And it's worse. It's kind of scary. The suicide rate is very high. The alcohol and drug use is very high, and it's easy now because you can get these things delivered to your house. Kind of scary once I realized that they could deliver alcohol and marijuana and medication to people just from the internet. So in spite of all this diagnosis, 50% of students, kids, adolescents, and adults are misdiagnosed because they haven't had testing at all or the right testing. And where does this fit in? If you don't have the right testing, your students, whether they're in elementary school, middle school, high school, or college, are not going to be able to get accommodations and help in school because it has to be documented. Or if you're older and you need extra time for the SAT test or the GRE for college or a medical board or a law board, you still need to have this documented. So it's just a whole uncertainty in our healthcare community. I mean, we know that the percentage of COVID has gone down, thank God, but it's still so uncertain what the percentages are, the tests accurate. Think about all the uncertainty with the vaccine we're hearing about. So part of the difficulty now is everything is changing, even with the schools opening. Most schools are just starting to open in the next couple of weeks, but we know that that could change depending on how things go. But for students who have been on the internet, it's going to be a good but a very difficult change going back to school, and for teachers. So we need a solution to this. And one of the reasons I feel like our country has this healthcare crisis is this is on the back burner. Out of all health issues, mental health, the budget for mental health is 1/100th of the budget for our healthcare in the United States. That's very sad considering 40 to 50% of people are having issues with this. And this is getting better. Thank goodness they've allowed us to use kind of the internet and Zoom and telehealth to help people. So let me talk a little bit more about what these things are. Some of you may kind of just be starting to this. So let's kind of talk about what this is. The first thing we're going to look at is inattention. Inattention and ADD has three parts. The inattention is the part that's hidden. You're distracted, you're daydreaming, you have a hard time listening in conversation, staying focused, you have a hard time following through and getting your work done and your homework done, or losing your homework, or forgetful. This has gotten so much worse with all of us on the internet. Having to sit in front of a computer like you're doing now and pay attention and look at the screen. If you're a student or me as a presenter, I have your faces blocked out so I can't even see you, but I have to sit there and pay attention, or you have to listen to me. It's a lot harder than it is in person, which is one of the advantages of opening up schools in a safe way. But this is missed a lot. You can be an A student, you could have no behavior problems at all, and you can have ADD, especially if your child is a girl or you're an adult, and it would get totally missed for sometimes your whole life. Impulsivity. Impulsivity is acting before you think. We think of something physical. If you're a sports fan and you're watching sports like hockey and football, you see a lot of impulsivity. They get in fights and things like that. There's a lot of impulsivity with the politics right now and people losing their temper quickly. But impulsivity can be verbal. Interrupting is impulsivity. Being impatient, having a hard time waiting your turn and waiting in line, blurting out in conversations. This has gotten a lot worse in the last couple months, especially in the political area, but impulsivity is one of the core characteristics of ADD. There's inattention, impulsivity, and hyperactivity. This is what we still think of. Someone who's really fidgety, they can't sit still. They're squirming with their hands or feet. When I talk to kids and adolescents on Zoom that have ADHD, they're moving so much, I can't see them in the screen. They're like dancing in the screen and trying to sit still and talking, and it's really hard to sit still. It could be your feet. You have a hard time remaining seated, but even if you're sitting still, you're feeling restless. Even people with ADD tell me when they used to go to a movie in the movie theaters, they couldn't make it through a whole movie. They had to look at their phones, or they had to get up because they were just getting antsy. Can't turn your brain off. So at night, your brain keeps going and going and going. It often leads you to be late, and you can't calm down. Some of you remember the Ever Ready bunny commercials that say it keeps going and going. So some parents describe kids with ADHD as being wound up with a motor. And then all of a sudden they wear out of energy and they poop out. But it's very hard if you're trying to go to school on the internet and you're at home with a couple kids, or if you're a teacher and you probably have 2 or 3 kids like this in your class, to really get them to pay attention, let alone sit still. So what about adults with ADD and ADHD? It shows up in different ways. It shows up in marital problems. You forget to pick the kids up. You forget to get them to do their homework. And as with during COVID, one of you has had to be your child's teacher to help them kind of get on the internet and do their homework. It relates to marital problems and family. And if you're trying to do parenting with your children and your children have ADHD, or autistic spectrum disorder or anxious or defiant, and you aren't consistent because you have ADHD, it's very difficult. If you're an adult and you're working and you're having to do paperwork and turn in reports and show up to work on time, it's very hard if you have ADHD. If you're in college, it's even hard to get through a semester. You get bored. Matter of fact, adults with ADD switch majors more times than other adults do. To keep track of your classes, you don't have them every day. Drug and alcohol use, even before COVID, 50% of young adults were self-medicating themselves for this. It's even higher now. But what makes it more complicated is there's lots of things that go along with ADD, like anxiety and depression and obsessive compulsive disorder. And sometimes there's degrees of all these in people. Everyone's different. So I like to call ADD interest deficit disorder. You know why? Because it shows up when you're bored. It doesn't show up when you're interested. It doesn't show up when you're playing a video game at home. It shows up when you're bored and you have to do something tedious like homework or your taxes as an adult. So I like to call it interest deficit disorder. And this is why it's so important to get accommodations in school, because if you can't pay attention and things are boring to you and you're sitting in the back of your class and you're daydreaming or distracted or you're trying to do your work at home, you're going to underachieve and you need help to kind of get accommodations to make it fair, to make it that you have an ability to express your potential. We're going to get into that. So this is a new slide I created, so I hope you guys can see it. It's just a statistic that shows how common things with ADD are. This was before COVID, anxiety and depression, but learning disabilities like math, reading, spelling, or what they still sometimes will call dyslexia. 50% of students with ADD and ADHD have some sort of a learning disability. It can be a processing disorder. Now, here's really important information. The only way to tell if it's ADD or a learning disability or both is to do testing. And treatment-wise, you have to treat the ADD first in order to help the learning issues, because if you can't pay attention and sit still, it's going to be really hard to catch up in reading and math or speech or anything. So that's something I'll say again, but there's a big overlap. Now, the school before COVID would do tests for learning disabilities. They don't really do tests, they do surveys, questionnaires for you and the teacher for ADD symptoms that it doesn't really tell us if it's caused by ADD or ADHD. So we'll go over that. So why are we even talking about this? Why do we need accommodations and modifications? Because individuals with learning disabilities and ADD and anxiety and depression, they're much more likely to have educational limitations as a result. Therefore, their accommodations are necessary to help level the playing field, so people have the opportunity to perform in a manner more consistent with their true abilities. And when we do the accommodation testing, we have to prove that somebody's disabilities are getting in the way of them performing to their true ability or intelligence. That's really the basis of the testing. We have to prove that so they can get help, and it can be more fair and kind of level the playing field. And this is a difficulty because the schools were doing testing for learning disabilities. They're, from what I talked about, I talked to someone at one of the local school districts in our county today. She told me they're still catching up from the testing in the spring, because when COVID hit, everything got delayed. And the whole process can take 3 to 5 months to get the school to do testing for learning disabilities. So here's a boy, let's say this is in November and school's been open for a month. And he's in the principal's office every single week. He's getting in fights on the playground. He's interrupting. He's saying the wrong things in class. He's teasing kids. And the principal says, think about what you do before you do it. Can you read what the boy says? By the time I think about it, I've already done it. So he's impulsive. But what we need to do is test the brain. We need to do testing, because If it's ADHD or anxiety or Asperger's, it's in his brain and he can't control it himself. And he needs some training and treatment and he needs some accommodations so he has that ability to control it and achieve. So one of the difficulties, and I mentioned this that happened with my cousin's child, and it still happens, is when I started in this field 35 years ago, we were able to do this testing on a much more regular basis. But the HMOs came around and they really limited people's ability to get testing. And a lot of companies like Kaiser came in and started doing very quick visits, and there's some good reasons for that because they want to triage and really get people who need help, help first. But testing is not required. It's not required even for a diagnosis for ADHD. You can see a physician for 15 minutes and get a prescription without having any testing or diagnosis. That still happens, 35 years from when I started practicing. So what do? How do we figure this out? This is a list of tests that are done by specialists like psychologists like me that specialize in ADD and autistic spectrum disorder and anxiety and learning disabilities. The first thing we do is a very thorough clinical interview or intake, we call it. Why do we have to be thorough? First of all, we have to find out when the symptoms started. By definition, they have to start when a child's in elementary school, even if they're not diagnosed. There's a family history of it almost all the time. These are genetic areas and disorders. We have to make sure it's interfering with school and grades. I like to see how students do in sports and social activities, even though they're limited now, because the attention, the impulsivity, the social anxiety is going to show up in other areas. We need to make sure there are other things rule out, like head injuries or seizures or medical conditions. So it's really important to do this clinical interview or intake. This is what Jolie was mentioning. We're going to go ahead and give you an opportunity to schedule those, because how we do it here at Attention Learning Centers is I do this first interview myself, and I do most of them over Zoom, although we can do them in person. And then from there, I recommend which of these tests that someone needs, either for a diagnosis or for a diagnosis and accommodation in school or college, or for a test like the SAT or GRE or MCATs or LSAT or some sort of medical board or law board. So for children, one of the other things we do is we have the parents and teachers, or for an adult, we have the adult or significant other family member fill out these behavior rating skills. If you've been tested by the school district or other people, you may have received these. They're good to look at kind of the severity of symptoms. And I got to tell you something really important. They're not accurate. They're very subjective. One parent may rate symptoms 100% and the other parent rates them 5%. One teacher may rate them 90% and another teacher the same day may rate them 20%. They're very subjective, but if you do them over time, they're really good at looking for improvement. There are some really valuable things about these rating skills, especially for autism and Asperger's. They have very specific questions about things like eye contact, communication, getting stuck on things, getting obsessed with facts. There's certain questions that are like red flags, but overall, they're very subjective and they don't tell us what's causing it. So here's something that's important to think about now. During COVID, you can have symptoms of ADD and anxiety that are due to COVID. Or you can have them already and they're getting stirred up a lot now, or they'll get stirred up when people have to go back to school in person. So we also, our next test we do is a computerized attention test. These are really boring computer tests that measure how well you pay attention and how impulsive and patient you are when something's really, really boring. Remember, I called ADD interest deficit disorder. So it measures people's attention, impulsivity, hyperactivity. For adults, it measures visual and auditory memory and short and long-term memory when something's easy and boring. But the tests that are really important for accommodations are this next one, IQ and achievement tests. I'm going to go over those a lot. IQ tests are called intelligence tests. That's your ability that you're kind of born with. Achievement are acquired skills like math, reading, spelling, things you learn in school, things you kind of learn from even doing a class on Zoom. And then for children and adults, we do a personality test that looks at anxiety and depression and social anxiety. For adults, sometimes we have to look at more serious things like bipolar, schizophrenia, because sometimes the symptoms can look like ADD. And during COVID, we're seeing a lot of people have more severe symptoms just because of all the isolation and the stress and the anxiety, and losing their jobs and worried about their health. So this is the list of tests that we do here at Attention Learning Centers, but today I'm going to go over them. I'm really going to focus on the IQ and achievement tests. So what is accommodation testing? What we do and what I do based on my first interview or intake with people is I select which evaluation instruments or tests we're going to need, because everyone is a little different, but we do have to assess their cognitive ability and IQ versus achievement, because we have to show how they're having a problem achieving, so you can get help with achievement, because achievement is what school is really based on and what all these standardized tests are measured. So what are IQ and achievement tests? Some of you are familiar with these. Currently, there's one company that is kind of making and developing all the tests, and they've been, around for like 70 years. It's called Wechsler Skills, and a company called Psychological Corporation owns it now. And there's a Wechsler Intelligence Scale, and there's one for children called the WISC, Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, and one for adults or anyone over 16 called the WAIST, Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. If you are in this process, I would write these down, because if you sometimes specifically have to ask the schools or the colleges to do these tests. Now, like I said, they're probably not going to start doing these for another couple months when school starts. And you have to go through a process where you have to have a meeting and request these tests. I was explaining this to a parent today. And then after the meeting, they have another 2 months to get the tests done and another month to get the results. So this process can take 5 months. So this is why we've been so busy since COVID hit, because the ability to get these tests done at a public school or a private school or college haven't been there because they've been closed. So the intelligence tests are done for both children and adults, and it measures your ability. The achievement test, and the ones we do are, the main one we do is called the Wechsler, the same company, Individual Achievement Test, or WIAT for short. We abbreviate these. It's a standard assessment, and it measures reading and math and written language and oral language, but it has a very important measure for accommodations called fluency. Fluency is how you do within time constraints, because in order to get accommodations, it's harder than it used to be to obtain these. You not only have to show there's deficits, but you have to show you can't get done in an average amount of time because you're asking for extra time. And that's the main accommodation students get, is extra time to take a test, extra time to finish something in class, whether you're in first grade or you're taking a law board. This is the main accommodation we try to get. So we have to prove this. So this is a really old slide, but this was one of the first versions of the IQ test for children. But it shows all these types of IQ, but these really low scores here, and things like arithmetic, which is doing word problems in your head, digit span, repeating numbers forwards and backwards, things that are really boring that require sustained attention. They call this working memory now. And achievement tests, again, this is an old slide, but achievement tests are things like reading, math, and spelling, and all of these are on a scale where it's a norm, it's an average. An average is 100, it's like a C grade, or if any of you have looked at bell-shaped curves, These are all based on statistics and what's average for somebody at a certain age and a certain gender. So like a 8-year-old boy or like a 25-year-old female. And it's all based on years and years of statistics. So what you're looking for is the difference between your ability or IQ and the difference between your learning or achievement. And nowadays we have to show a fluency that how you can achieve and how you test over a time limit. So when we look at ADD, one of the things we discovered 20 years ago is there's different types of ADD. And why this is important is ADD is often misdiagnosed because we're looking for people that are hyperactive and impulsive. But like I said earlier, you can be inattentive and daydreaming and not have any behavior problems in school. You can have anxiety and you could get stuck in things and obsess on things, and that can slow you down, but you can have ADD with it. Or you could have ADD and be depressed and be very sluggish and just take a long time to get things done and start your work, and just very, very hard to wake up and get going. And these are really important because each of these types of ADD is treated differently with different types of medicine, or what we do in here in our centers here, Attention Learning Center, we do different types of biofeedback and neurofeedback based on the type of ADD. So some of you are interested in the QEEG brain map, and my webinar next week, a week from the day, and the 24th, is going to go over this in detail. But I have a couple slides I'm going to show you because people always ask me about this, and I kind of helped invent this years and years ago, so I'm kind of very familiar with it. So this would be like someone's nose in the front, and each of these dots is where we put the sensors. So the EEG are your brain waves. I hope all of you have brain waves now. Raise your hand if you have brain waves now. Just looking to see how many people are gonna pay attention here, because if you don't have brain waves, it's not good. I don't think you'd be on this webinar. You'd be really bored, but you'd be in a coma, or God forbid, you wouldn't be alive anymore, because even when you sleep, you have brain waves. But people who have ADD, kids, adolescents, adults, when they're awake, their brains are slow and they have all this data, like these slow, daydreamy, drowsy brain waves, even at 10 o'clock when they're awake and alert and they've had a good night's sleep. What about autism? More people are familiar with autism now. There's lots of media and much more diagnosis, because we're catching children with speech problems and eye contact problems even before a year. But there's three kind of core characteristics of autism. There's impaired social interactions, sometimes oblivious to friends. There's a compared communication, where sometimes you're nonverbal or you just have limited communication. But there's also these behaviors, and this is what was so frustrating with my cousin's child. He was flapping his arms, we call it stemming. He was walking on his toes. I mean, he didn't have terrible eye contact, and you don't see that with ADD. The pediatricians are getting much better. They're supposed to screen for this at 18 months and 2 years, and this is one of the reasons autism is diagnosed so much better, usually by 3. And here's a pattern with someone that has autism, and instead of all this slow activity of what we call theta, this kind of circle at the bottom is when your brain's going really fast and you're stuck on things and you're obsessing on things and you just can't stop playing a computer game or playing with your Legos. And people that have autistic spectrum disorder, instead of their brains going slow, their brains are going too fast. But here's one of my frustrations, and this is what almost happened to my cousin's child. You can be hyperactive and look like you have severe hyperactivity with both, but if you have anxiety or autism and your brain is going fast and you take a stimulant, it's going to make you a lot worse. And a lot of parents have their students do this, and they get worse, and they just stop and say, forget it, I'm not going to ever do that again. 10 years later, they're failing out of school. So I don't want any of you to get in that dilemma, which is why I want to emphasize how important testing is. Asperger's, of these areas I'm talking about today, is actually, I think, the hardest one to diagnose, Because if you have Asperger's, which is one of the types of autistic spectrum disorder, you're very bright, you're often gifted, you have very good language skills, you can be a professor or a researcher. Many of the adults I work with Asperger's are engineers and accountants or researchers, but let me tell you what happens. It's social. It's not academic. They could be a straight A student, but they're not doing any social interactions. They don't have friends. As a matter of fact, my students with Asperger's, interestingly enough, like being home during COVID because they don't want to go out. They have social anxiety. They don't want to go back to school. They don't miss their friends, or at least they can't communicate that. They're fine with being home and doing computer games and building Legos and reading books and working on the internet. We know that's not a balanced life. The reason is it's very hard for them. They have problems with eye contact. They might have some friends, but they're not the same age. They're really good with adults or kids, but they're not the same age. They have a hard time sharing their feelings. The big thing with Asperger's is individuals, whether it's a child, adolescent, or adult, they can't express their feelings, but they can't even understand feelings. An adult with Asperger's told me feelings were a foreign language. He just didn't get it. He was very bright. When I asked him how he felt, he would give me all these descriptions of the event, but he couldn't tell me how it feels. So if you're older and you're in high school or you're in a relationship or you're married and you can't express your feelings, it's very difficult after a certain amount of time. And so many couples come in to me, to be honest with you, a lot of wives contact us and they think their husbands have this, and they're bright and they're very nice people, but they just can't express their feelings. And we have treatments and testing for this. So what would a brain map like Asperger's look like? This is a different picture. Now, we have a webinar on our website, Attention Learning Center, that has like a whole hour on this. But this is the nose at the top and the ears. And our kind of color code is a little different. Instead of red being high, orange is high and blue is low. You see this area where I'm pointing to by the right ear here? By the right ear is this is called our right temporal parietal area right here by the ear. And this relates to your social and emotional control. So as a child, you have meltdowns. You have meltdowns, but you can't express your feelings. So you have meltdowns and you don't know how to express your feelings, and you have a tantrum and you throw yourself on the floor and you start throwing things. As an adult, it shows up in another way, but you get very frustrated, but you can't express your feelings. And adults can even get violent when this happens. And there's examples of this, unfortunately, and even kids that get bullied and shootings and some really negative things that happen if you have Asperger's and depressed and can't express your feelings. But this is our pattern we see with 80% of people with Asperger's in this right parietal temporal area by the ear. And the really important other aspect of this, we can train this area to improve with neurofeedback and give people the ability to pay attention and become aware of their feelings and express feelings, therefore have healthier relationships. Very, very important. So when we do all these tests, the last step in our process, the first step is an interview intake. The second part is these tests, and we select these based on what you need for the school, what you need for the testing organization like the SAT or Educational Treatment Services. And then we give you a very long report. The reports are 10 pages single-spaced, like 20 pages of a report. But what I do and what we're supposed to do as psychologists are supposed to sit down and explain this to you. Answer your questions, explain what this means, explain the strengths and weaknesses, and find out if you qualify for accommodations, what type of help you can get, and most importantly, what treatments that you can do to help your brain so you can improve. Not just get extra time for the test, which is important, but how you can train your brain so you can be successful in school or a job or a relationship. That's the real important outcomes to this. People always ask me, why do we have to go over the results? can't you just write the report and get us extra time? Yes, we can. But you know what? That's just a step in the journey. The journey is really to achieve your potential and to be able to heal your brain and work and achieve to your potential. I hope that makes sense. So what I'm going to do now is show you a couple other things. I just want to remind you that at the end, I'm going to take questions, and we are going to just kind of explain to you how to make that first appointment for the intake. If any of you are in a crisis now and kind of worried because your kids are starting school next week, or you don't want to wait till January to get this kind of going, feel free to contact us at our office. We even have an appointment tomorrow because we know some people take this and you're in your wit's end and you need to do something right away. This whole situation has been made worse because of COVID, and it's obviously gotten better, but think about it. There's different information every day. You know, do we still have to wear a mask? Is it safe to go back to school? I'm a sports fan. My university, I went to University of Michigan. They announced yesterday in the Big Ten they're going to have football. You know, some people are in favor of it and some people aren't in favor of it. But there's students in colleges that are kind of quarantined and went back to school, but they have to take classes from their dorms. So there's a safety issue. What's the best way for your student to learn? Should they go back to school? Should they do it all remotely or distance? Can you do a hybrid, which is a good kind of compromise, do part at home and part at school? Is it safe to go back to school? I've seen some of the classrooms that they're going to have the seats apart, one student to a table instead of two. They're going to have these plastic barriers. We used to call them offices or privacy folders in between. Most of the new classes have really good ventilation and air filters in there. So that's another decision. Because the classes are going to be smaller, one of the advantages is there's going to be a lower student to teacher ratio, but on the internet, it's been harder because you still got 20 or 30 kids on a Zoom system. One of the advantages of going back to school is a lot of kids were getting their breakfast and their lunch at school. So there's been a lot of really good programs. Saddleback Church, which we kind of supports this support group, has been really good with their food pantry. I know some of you work at the food pantry, and I support that very highly, but it's been really important to get people meals during this time. Another difficulty for you, if you're a parent, you've had to be a teacher. You still have to get your kids to get your homework and sit in front of the computer and wake them up when they don't have to go anywhere. You have to be your student's therapist. You have to talk to them. You have to encourage them. A lot of them are really depressed and anxious. You have to be a psychiatrist if your student's taking medication and they used to get it at lunch, or you have to monitor it. And in the midst of all this, you have all the anxiety and depression that's going on with COVID. Technology problems. Some of you may have had technology problems getting into the webinar today. I think my estimate is about 80% of the world is on the internet, and in the United States, it's all at the same time. So, I mean, I just at home went to the highest speed of internet, and it's still once or twice a day freezes up, and I'm shocked, but everybody's using the internet. So there's technology problems, just getting access, or something freezing up, or your student has to turn an assignment in and the computer freezes. How frustrating is that if you get your homework done and you don't get credit for it because the internet's down? Transportation's another issue in school. Most parents nowadays drive their kids to school, but you know, there's school buses that are needed for some kids. There's public transportation and Ubers and Lyfts, and that's more complicated now. So I talked to a parent yesterday who had 8 children, and they were all going to school at the internet at the same time. That's really hard. It's hard enough with just one. If you're at home, you have distractions. You have the other students, you have pets. If you're an adult and you're working at home and your kids are working at home, it can be very distracting. You don't have a separate room for each of your children or separate space. You may not even have a separate computer. The physical activity access has been limited. Some of the gyms are just starting to open up, and this is one of the advantages in school is they have PE. Social connection with other students is very limited. I mean, you can see me. I can't see most of you because I have it kind of closed off, but this is social interaction. But if you're a student, it's very hard to make a new friend. It's very hard to kind of have intimate conversations in this format and express your feelings. So I think there's a lot of missing pieces for brain health. And some of the reasons are because we don't have individualized systems. So the whole purpose of testing is to get an individualized profile of each student to know what their strengths and weaknesses and diagnoses are, so we can help them in school and help their brains and help them at home. And if we have an individualized system, we can get to the best solutions. We have to test for anxiety, especially nowadays. We have to do stress management. I'm going to talk about biofeedback, this new treatment we do for stress management, which is so successful for test anxiety. And the research they did at San Francisco State with math classes, students' math grades went up 2 grade levels just as they controlled their anxiety through biofeedback. We have to do attention training. We have to look at the brain. We really have to test the brain, and we have to train the attention. And we need a system that does this. Our system is kind of broken and stuck and overloaded right now. So at our centers, which I've developed, like we call it the Linden Brain Health System, because we want to look at all this. We want to look at all the pieces and use technology, because we have this technology, and we do different types of neurofeedback, which is brain training is sometimes called. We do biofeedback for stress management and test anxiety and sleep. We do counseling and therapy. We do direct neurofeedback, which is a new type of neurofeedback that stimulates the brain for depression and memory. So let me explain why starting this and what this is, and then we'll take some questions. Neurofeedback, and we'll talk about that at our webinar next week, is not something new. I learned about this in college in 1982. Studies with ADD over 10 years showed that 15 out of 16 behaviors were improved 10 years ago. Neurofeedback has the highest success ratio of any treatment ever studied, because it's, and especially if it's based on the brain map I showed you. And for autism and Asperger's, it has the highest benefit to harm ratio of any treatment study. That means how many people get better versus how many get worse. And I'm not going to go over the research today, but we have it on our website, and I'll be going over that in my other webinars. But let me explain what neurofeedback is. So neurofeedback takes your brain waves, and it gives you or your student feedback every second if they're going too slow, which is in a red bar, if they're going too fast, which is a yellow bar. And your brain uses this feedback to train your brain if it's anxious to calm down, if it's tired and daydreamy to get more activated. And we do this in the area of the brain that the testing shows us is deficient. And we do it over time, and these brain areas improve, and the brain waves normalize, and we see lasting results. So sometimes I'll try to demonstrate this. If you you can kind of see a beep, and when you kind of pay attention, you get rewards. This doesn't work real well in my Zoom meetings, but in my webinars, you'll see this. You're playing computer games with your brain. And as you do that, what happens is, like this is a movie, and the movie will get larger and bigger. If you watch this here, so by paying attention and staying calm, you are playing the movie. Let me kind of explain more about some coping skills, and then we'll talk about testing, and I'll take questions. So some coping skills for ADD, especially if you're kind of, had your kids at home, is to expect these skills. These are some of the issues. You're quarantined, there's limited activity. Having a consistent structure is really important, especially until your kids go back to school or go back to college. wake up at the same time, have the same time for homework, have the same bedtime. And limiting screen time is so important right now because we're on the computer already for school or work. There's some new research, and there's a new TV show out that shows how media now is getting addicting, and it targets your behavior and habits, and it sends you texts and it sends you alert to keep you addicted. And it really can be very stressful and addicting and take up an amount of time that you need for homework and school and social interactions. So let me show you, if someone has anxiety, their brain waves here, this is the fast activity, is way too high, and we have to slow that down. And a lot of people have anxiety and they have physical symptoms like headaches, but the biggest thing we see, we're talking about today, is test anxiety. You get very nervous for tests. Your student forgets what they studied. I mean, public speaking is the same way. If you're very nervous and you get up to give a talk, you're going to forget what you're talking about. Performance and sports choking. Unfortunately, I think we saw an example of this with one of our local sports teams this week that's playing in a different environment, in a bubble, and has all this pressure to succeed. And it's very hard to practice to play basketball with no fans. And if you have a lot of pressure on you and it's the last game of the year and you can't control your anxiety and your brain activity, you're not going to perform well. We've seen the same thing in every professional sport where the favorites are being upset. So these are symptoms of anxiety, and being irritable and impatient is part of this. And sleep problems is a common thing we're hearing about now. Just from being home and on the computer, fatigue and exhaustion. I mean, sitting in front of the computer for 5, 6, 7 hours a day, our brains were not set up for this. Our bodies were not set up to sit here and not move around. So if we have combinations of ADD and anxiety and Asperger's, we usually treat the anxiety first because it's quicker, and we give people skills so they can get right back into their activities of school or work in person. And we do a lot of what's called biofeedback. Biofeedback has been around since 1960. It involves learning how to regulate your breathing and kind of self-regulation. And we teach people it's the exercise that you practice twice a day, but you can use it before you take a test, or before you give a speech, or before you are in a sports performance or a musical performance. And our biofeedback screens look something like this, where you breathe in for 6 seconds and you breathe out, and you learn to get your breathing and your heart rate in sync. We call this heart rate variability. And this is what the Olympic teams are doing, and what a lot of schools are starting to do with students and athletes to really optimize their test anxiety and their achievement. This is called biofeedback. We usually start with this, and we do 5 sessions in the office, and we can do this very quickly in a couple weeks, even before kids go back to school in the next 3 weeks or so. And this is a screen, and you can kind of see there's a little image or game, and as you relax, if this works, you can kind of see your breathing follows this pacer. And as you breathe in and breathe out, you kind of change the screen, and you hear this relaxing music. You breathe in your nose, breathe out through your mouth, into your nose, and out through your mouth. But this is really important, even if you're going to do a standardized test. This could be very important if you have to take the SATs or an entrance exam or a final exam. And especially since our students are behind, this is really, really important to do, to be able to control your anxiety. So what are some other tips you can do for your kind of anxiety? These are some tips that we kind of go over with people. Staying in the present. Don't worry about the future, especially now, because I think we've been hit in the head that none of us can control the future. Expect problems. You know, we know there are going to be problems in life. And I think every day in the news, there's another problem with the fires or hurricanes or COVID or the economy. Limit your information on media. I mean, nowadays, kids get this information on their phones. Aerobic exercise is so important, whether you're walking or playing tennis or exercising at home. You need to get your heart and body in shape. And some of you heard that there's an epidemic with obesity now because so many people haven't exercised. Most of us get this quarantine 15 pounds that we kind of joke about, but a lot of people have gained a lot of weight during COVID. Praying for things out of our control and having hope is so important. And at Saddleback Church, Rick Warren goes over this a lot. But with your kids, if they're going back to school soon, reassure them that they're safe. Tell them they can talk about things in their mind and worries. This too shall pass. And Rick Warren will often say, replace your panic with prayer. You know, if you're panicking and nervous and you pray or you listen to worship music, that often goes away very quickly, and we integrate that with our biofeedback and relaxation training, and it works very, very well. Stay connected with your friends and family. Once a day, especially if you don't have anyone living with you, talk to a friend, go on Zoom, go on FaceTime, even sending a text. Humor is very important. Watching funny movies, watching things on YouTube. You know, with all the negative, stressful stuff on the news, it's even more important. Singing is very healthy, believe it or not. It's good for our lungs. It's good for our brains. If you like to sing, singing out loud, worship music. Rick Warren often says, replace your worry with worship. And breathe. And one of the things that we talk about is stop, take a deep breath, and rethink what you're going through. Don't get stuck on anything. Try to enjoy the journey. And a lot of people have had significant positive things happen over COVID, where you've got in touch with your family and friends, or you've changed careers, or you've kind of figured out what's more important, because a lot of us have had to think about what the most important things in our lives is. So what do we do with accommodations? What are some accommodations that we can write in a report or you can get through a school or college? Let me go through these and then we'll take questions. The most important one is extra time for exams and projects and tests. So this can be a third grader taking a math test. It could be taking your finals. It could be taking your SATs to get into college, your graduate school test, your law boards, your medical boards. You can get extra time or double time. This has to be documented with our testing and show that you need extra time and you don't do well in their time constraints. Number two, a quiet room for testing, a room without distractions. It used to be that before these tests were on the computer, you had to take them in a big room. I remember taking my psychology board and I was in an auditorium with, I think, 1,000 people. That was really distracting. I could hear people getting frustrated and panting and breathing hard before the test. Reduced assignments and homework. Now, this isn't an excuse to get less homework, but if your student has 50 math problems, maybe they do the odd ones. Having a little bit of a flexibility in students getting their homework done late, or more frustratingly, forgetting to turn it in if they're sitting there in their backpack and they forget. Where you're seated in class as a common accommodations. If you have one ADD and you get a 504, which is a type of modification in the class, you can have your students sit up front, away from distractions. Now, do kids like to do that? No, they like to sit in the back. But this is what I tell kids. If you're going to an Angel game or you're going to a concert to see your favorite singer like Taylor Swift, would you rather have a front row seat or would you rather be in the back? Of course you'd rather have a front row seat. You're more engaged, it's more exciting. So sitting in front of the class, there's no cost for it. You just have to get this accommodation. It's pretty hard to fall asleep if you're in the front of the class because the teacher's going to see that. We can get an accommodation, a modification for extra breaks. If you have a really long 2-hour class, maybe you need 3 breaks instead of 2. If you have a 3-hour test, you can take a break. A lot of students do better having extra breaks. Social skills are one of the accommodations you can get in schools, especially for younger kids. And they teach kids how to make friends and how to get along and how to join a group. And where do they teach this? They teach this in groups, but a lot of it happens on the playground and during recess, which is one reason, one benefit of going back to school, because this is very hard to do now, especially with the quarantine and shutdowns. Speech therapy. If your student has a speech disorder or autistic spectrum disorder, you can get speech therapy through the school districts. RSP, or Resource Specialist Program. This is like tutoring and helping certain academic subjects like reading, math, written language, spelling. This is primarily for elementary school students, but you have to get proof and you have to get a written report, and you have to send this to the school districts or the colleges to get these approved. Now, is everyone approved? No, because so many people have applied for accommodations and modifications, and unfortunately some people have fudged and not had real testing, that they're much more thorough than they used to be. If your student has a behavior problem or autism, they can get an aide in class, someone who sits with them like a behavior therapist and helps redirect them, helps monitor their behavior. Special ed classes usually have an aide in the class with the teacher. If a student has more significant behavior problems or autism, they can be in a special day class, which is a special ed class the whole day. These are much smaller, typically 5 to 10 kids. But again, you have to have the testing to get these accommodations. For 504, they're ADD, they're called 504. And for learning disabilities and speech and autism, they're called an IEP. But the IEP in 504 is the accommodations and modifications you get. A lot of parents think it's the testing. The testing is step one. It's not always done. If you get this from the school, every year they're supposed to do the academic testing, and every 3 years they're supposed to go through all their tests again. So that's what will happen when schools kind of get back to normal. But a lot of the school districts and colleges are way behind in this because of COVID. So the other part of this is a lot of the students I see, they're kind of given up. The statistics show for ADD, 1/3 of students with ADD, even though they're brighter than people that don't have it, don't even finish school. So self-esteem really suffers a lot. A lot of the students I see, even when they're like, 8 or 9, it's very sad. They say, I'm stupid. Kids call me retarded. I'm stupid. I can't do well in school. Even when I try, I can't pass the class. Well, if you have ADD or a learning disability or autism or Asperger's or anxiety, no matter how hard you try, you still have an obstacle. That's the reason it's considered a disability and why we can train it and why you can get accommodations. But this is important. We've known this for a while. One of the greatest discoveries on earth is that a person can change their future by just changing their attitude. Now, it sounds simple, but we know it isn't. It's one of the only things that no one else could take away from us. I remember when I was in college, I read this book called The Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, and he was a Holocaust survivor in Germany. And he said his attitude is what kept him alive, just finding something that was significant. Another thing that I heard, and it's an abbreviation for Yahoo with only one O, is you always have options. You know what? You might feel like you or your students don't have options, but there's always an option. It may not be the option you want, but you know what? It may end up being an option that's better than what you initially thought. But having a really good attitude, I think, in my opinion, is the most successful trait we can have in our life. Another thing that's really important is to realize that these problems have purpose, and a lot of people who have obstacles, especially in school, once they get them figured out and they get accommodations and they get training and they do better, they thrive in certain areas, and many of them can be successful in business
or be pastors, or who knows, definitely be an athlete, be president, be a professor. So one of my favorite Bible verses in Saddleback is Rick Warren's doing a great job teaching 24 weeks on this, is from James. And there's different versions of this, but consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, when you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance, or some people call it endurance. Let perseverance and faith finish at work so you may be mature and complete. Well, this is really a test of our perseverance. And if you're in school, or your students are in school, this is really challenging. But if you get through it and you have perseverance, not only will you be more successful, but you may end up finding a whole different career or something you're good at. And then you may end up having a purpose and helping others with it. And Saddleback Church has support groups and ministries based on people going through things and helping other people for it. Part of this group is the parent ADD support group. Rejoice in the problem, not for the problems, and persevere and increase your endurance, because we know God can bring good out of bad. So I did a whole talk on parenting, and that's on our website, and I'm going to go over that in our next webinar. So just to finish up, all the things we do, except for the brain map, we can do remotely, and the accommodations testing. So we can do biofeedback remotely over the internet. We still have to do a couple sessions in the office. Once we come up with these diagnoses, and then you can get accommodations through the schools and colleges, the action plan goals are getting the accurate diagnosis so you can have an individualized treatment plan for ADD, autistic spectrum disorder, anxiety, depression, and concussions. Biofeedback and neurofeedback are successful treatments without side effects, but most importantly, they're long-term solutions. And we know that this is a journey. Most of these things are lifelong. They are obstacles, but they don't have to get in the way. Getting the right treatment, getting the right diagnosis, first of all, getting the right treatment, getting accommodations. This is the journey that can help people achieve their potential. And I just want to encourage you that it's a step-by-step process, and it doesn't happen overnight, but realize how important and how many resources are out there.